So as we go into this discussion with Mark and Jon, we will be recording this session. We will share that with you in an email after the session. We'll also be publishing that on Biznology, and there are some additional resources that you can use after this session and also that you can share with your colleagues. So with that, tell me about why you felt that it was the time to write this book. Who is it for? Why now?
Thank you, Jen, for that wonderful introduction. And hi, everybody. Jon and I are thrilled to talk about a real passion of ours and a real collaborative effort. When you ask the question, why now, the now actually has to go back about 2.5 years ago when Jon and I first had the idea for this book. And what really captured our attention is the research that Jon had done is that showed that out of more than 300 degree programs in the US in communications, there wasn't ever a single course ever taught on employee communications and engagement. And we thought, man, how could something so big and powerful and timely not have a textbook to help people learn more about it? So that really was the genesis of the idea. And then as we saw, obviously COVID has had a huge impact, not only on the workforce, but also on this book, and we can talk about that later. There was really even a bigger need for us to chronicle and to be thoughtful about how we could educate folks about this. And as we wrote the book, I think there are 3 key audiences. The first 2 I'll talk about, and I'll ask Jon to cover the third, because that's his real area of expertise. But our first audience for this were obviously communication and change professionals. These are currently people practicing employee communications or are responsible for engagement, employee engagement. And when you really think about it, this is a new and established communication discipline for change management. And a lot of communicators just don't really have the deep insight or the discipline to actually do this. So we thought, let's talk to them about change communications in particular. There's a big section in the book that is really dedicated to the evolution of employee communications to employee engagement, and then change management is a natural outgrowth of that. The second audience, if you will, that we created this book for were business leaders in general. So whether you're a general manager, particularly if you work in HCOM, your HR or communications or change leaders, we really felt like there was a role for this in educating general business leaders, because when they understand the power of employee communications and engaging their people through strategic communications, they're going to have far better results. And then the third, of course, as you would think in a textbook, is going to be students. And I'll let Jon talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've been in the world of education since the mid-90s at this point, which is hard to believe. But over that time, there's been a lot of shifting in what students in my field, in the kind of public relations advertising field, are looking for. And it used to be everyone wanted to go the agency route. I would say 80% of our students wanted to go that route. And over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a real change, and we're seeing more folks wanting to go into the client side, the corporate world. However, there's not really the training for that. Most of the exercises, most of the classes are more focused on things that are agency specific, and not how do you do internal communications? How do you deal with employees? Mark and I did a quick look on LinkedIn, and we were just saying, how many jobs are there available at a given time? And every time we looked, it was like 50,000 open positions. And we said, okay, there's a problem here if there's that many open positions. And so we felt this book could serve that need and maybe serve it as a bit of an impetus to try to get more education in this field, whether it's somebody who's in the classroom or somebody who is thinking about going into this area. Could be a job change, or could be somebody in the actual job and just doesn't have the training because they didn't get it in college. So that was another really big point of why we wrote the book.
That's awesome. And I love that it has both practical advice and case studies, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also kind of the academic rigor. I was thinking about it last night, and my dad was a doctor, and so much of medical education focused on let's address the problems, and as opposed to the holistic, nutrition or health maintenance. And I kind of feel like it's that about communications, right? We, as Mark said, we go through these change management initiatives with all organizations that we've all served. And I think until very recently, and maybe, COVID pandemic had something to do with this, communications was not thought of as that core foundational piece that you need in place to make effective change in any kind of organization. So having this approach where you're really looking at the fundamentals, both academically and professionally, I think is a great approach to do that. So what's in the book? I'll give a spoiler alert and say that a couple of our other member consultants are profiled through case studies in the book, Sharon McIntosh and John Clements, as well as a dear friend, colleague, and former client, Shell Holtz with WebCore. But tell me a little bit about what's in the book.
Sure. So I want to be clear that this isn't a textbook as you'd normally think of it. This is really a book that can serve as a text for a course, but we meant it more as an informational book, a skills book, really to be used, whether it's for the profession or for students. So to that end, we tried to make it as comprehensive as possible. So, we start out with kind of employee communication and the history. We define employee communication. What is it? What has it changed over the years? We talk about kind of what makes employee communication strategic. We go really deep into the competencies you need to kind of get into this profession. We talk a lot about measurement. Measurement, I think, is a recurring theme in the book. We touch upon it in almost every chapter in some way. But that's a foundational element to everything we do in communication. If you don't have the research to back up what you want to do, you've got some issues. We talk about ethics and compliance, which is a very important element. Influences that affect employee communications. We get into things like segmentation and channel auditing, assessment, and then we delve into things like executive communications. How do you talk to a CEO? How do you make those inroads? And then change management is another topic that we felt was really important to talk about. Mark, you can hit a few of these as well. You're muted.
You're still muted.
Sorry about that. I put myself on mute so I wouldn't interrupt. But thank you. But wait, there's more. So we have a number of additional chapters. One is on what we call the emerging internal communications expertise, and that includes both change management and storytelling, which is all about engaging hearts with heads, as I think a lot of people can really identify with. And we talk about the evolution, as I mentioned before, of what was employee communication to employee engagement and why that's happened and what's different about the world of employee engagement versus simply communicating to employees. And then we look beyond just change communications and look at other employee communication roles. So specifically within, for example, functional communications, HR or finance, or different parts of the operating portions of a business. It's really important to understand how those are also some really growing areas for communication. And we look, for example, at diversity, equity, and inclusion, DE&I, which is an emerging area that's getting a lot of attention. In fact, I think we actually have profiled a for-hire job that came from a very large company in the book. And then we look at current and future forces shaping employee communication. So this is where we sat down with, as you mentioned, Shell Holtz and Sharon McIntosh, who really are leaders in different areas of sort of future forces that are coming at us. So think, the gig economy, think artificial intelligence, blockchain, computing. Sharon gave us a series of great insights on the rising influence of employee activism and how important it is to listen and understand those voices on social issues that are coming from employees. So this book it's got a lot. I'm going to hold it up. It's a very full agenda with lots of different connection points for those who are doing this discipline.
Talk to me a little bit about blockchain and the role of blockchain in employee communications, because I think that, traditional communicators would be like, I don't even really understand what blockchain is, but what is its implication for communications?
Well, I think the implication for communicators is that as more processes go to the cloud, and there is sort of one single source of truth as organizations put their processes that are all digitally enhanced in the cloud, it could mean that the shape of the workforce will change. There could be far more outsourcing happening, and the definition of what an employee is could be quite different than what it looks like today. Because if you think about blockchain, it is all about automation. It's also all about access, about sort of joint problem solving, all in the cloud. And when you open things like that up, you're no longer limited solely to traditional quote unquote employees. So the implication could be there are fewer employees to call employees, but then you have all these people who are connected to your value chain, who represent your corporate image, your reputation, who impact the culture. So there's a lot of things kind of circling around that we really need to start thinking about.
Yeah,
Blockchain's one of them.
we've certainly heard about the role of blockchain and crypto, and the role of blockchain in supply chain, and looking at the provenance, where things come from, its role in
Yep.
ESG, to understand, where your food is coming from, or where your consumer packaged goods are coming from, and making sure that they meet ethical standards. And I think it's really interesting to think about that from the perspective of information and people. Who are the people in your value chain, and where is the information coming from? So certainly in this time of disinformation, misinformation, and distributed information, to have that single source of truth is a really interesting thing. And it ups the game for communications professionals to understand emerging technologies and how to use them, right?
Right. And the whole idea behind this particular chapter is to kind of open your eyes to look at the things that are happening around you that you may not think are important for you to understand, but very likely are.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these technologies were hastened by the pandemic. I really think when everyone all of a sudden had to kind of go their separate ways, everyone was doing their work from home, that only sped up what was inevitable anyway. So the idea of hiring people, maybe not even in the country, to do the work because they're the best experts in the area. Thinking about the use of AI and VR with meeting technology or other things. I think back to the days when I started, and it was a fax machine and maybe email, and we're way beyond that now. We're in a whole new territory.
Unless you're a lawyer, and then you're still using fax machines. We saw it in our consulting practices, companies and other types of organizations that had really never had a work from home strategy, suddenly having to send everyone home and realizing they didn't have a way to communicate and collaborate together. And so, throwing teams out there, scrambling to find a strategy to allow that. These aren't new technologies, Teams or, intranets, those kinds of things have been around for a while, but I think it's the strategic deployment, the communications about what you're doing, why you're doing it, the enablement of the people who are meant to be using this, and for what and why, right? And so it's caused a lot of more need for the tight collaboration between communications, IT, the people organization. I mean, do you address those issues?
We do. In fact, just as a point of timely reference, Microsoft just this week released a study that basically said, while they're trying to work and create a more flexible workforce where people can work more remotely, that they have identified very specific concerns about innovation by people working remotely. So it's quite interesting to see. This is a big issue that will be around for quite some time, and organizations need to think through it, and communicators need to be right in the middle of all that, right? As they help, hopefully their HR and general management partners think through, how do we change? What are the implications of this change? How do we communicate it? How do we reinforce it? How do we help create feedback loops to really understand how employees are reacting to it? How do we take those insights and apply them to the work that we're doing? So it's this continuous a cycle of feedback and insights is a really important piece that we also address in the measurement section of the book. So everything is integrally tied. We talk about these current issues. We're talking about how quickly the pandemic changed literally everything in terms of how the world is working, and probably no function, perhaps with the exception of HR, has been tasked more with having to help solve the implications of this than employee communications. I mean, communications in general, for sure, but it really has put the importance of employee communications and engagement on steroids. So another reason that the timeliness of this book really seems to have hit a sweet spot.
You also mentioned executive communications, and I think we've seen from the pandemic, from Black Lives Matter, Me Too, all these kind of converging issues, a call to executives, both internally and externally, to comment on within their organizations and also externally in the public, to take a stand on issues they've never been asked to weigh in on before, political issues and social issues. And how can leaders think about that? How can they think about using the communications professionals in their organization to help them make good decisions and enable that in an appropriate way?
Yeah, great question. And John, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. I think, in the work that I do, I know everything we do begins with research. So I think the biggest thing is understand what you have to really get a feel for. What are your employees thinking? What kind of action are they looking for from you as a leader and from you as a company? Kind of one of the things that I do in my job is we do a lot of research on those between the ages of 18 and 24. So it's always kind of the next group that's heading into the workforce. We've seen a lot of shifts in that group, again, over the last 10 years, where they're not just looking for jobs for the money. They want to work at a place they can really have pride in and that they feel represents them. So if you are a CEO and you're just thinking, well, everyone at the C-suite thinks this is what we're going to put out, you could alienate and lose a lot of your employees. We've seen that happen with Amazon, with Google, with other corporations where they are putting out messages that don't reflect their employees. And we talk about a lot of those in the book. And so when we think about things like DE&I and other social justice movements, and even corporate social responsibility, those have to be top of mind for CEOs, or not only are they not going to be able to recruit, they're going to lose people that they really need to talk to. So it's a lot of that listening. It's, as Mark talked about, the feedback loop. It's getting the pulse of what are my employees thinking and what are they looking for from us, and what kind of messages would they like to see us send out, and taking that into consideration before releasing anything.
And
I'm actually just looking at the book because there's a citation in there about how important engaging leadership, executive leadership, is in social channels. That there's a recruiting benefit that and it's not just 18 to 24-year-olds, but increasingly prospective employees are looking for social media presence. And there was also a piece about financial readers are more inclined to trust an executive who has a social media presence. So it's no longer just hey, it would be nice to have the CEO, the CFO, the CHRO, the executive, the C-suite executives participate in social media. It's rapidly becoming an expectation that they are part of that. And most of them aren't comfortable being in that space. So that is where they need to engage their communication staff and leaders to help them create that presence that works for them and for their organization.
Well, that really leads us into the role of, internal versus external. I think there's definitely, when you talk to the lawyers, what if this could go external? We can't put that on the internet, or we can't put that in a memo, or, it potentially could go external. And I think that is just a myth, that everything internal can and will in some way go external, and probably always did. It was just more word of mouth, and
it's just a lot easier now. Absolutely.
Seeing it on the internet. So how do you broach that challenge and that need to kind of educate the legal team to just embrace this, and also the collaboration that's needed between external and internal communicators?
Well, we talk a lot about trust as a building block to engagement. And when an employee gets a Google alert on their company that there's some major structural change or some big, merger, acquisition, or whatever, before they hear it from their own organization, the trust begins to erode, and you start multiplying that. And you see leaders aren't prepared to talk about it. And all of a sudden you get a very clear picture about why engagement is beginning to decline or plummet. So it often doesn't even take a lot of explanation from the communication person, usually in partnership with HR. When there's a significant drop in engagement, there's usually a very clear reason. And we can often tie it, just the numbers and timing, to announcements that have gone out that have been poorly managed or not managed at all. So that's one way we get their attention to say, we need to start building trust. But ideally, we're not doing this in response. We're building this proactively, right? We are finding ways to, what Jon and I have already said about building these continuous feedback loops, showing that the organization is listening to them. I know when I worked at DuPont and we were going through the Dow DuPont transaction, one of the big things that we did was to build those insights. We would poll employees before the meetings to say, what's on your mind? And we would build the agenda around those questions. And then we'd go back to them after the CEO had his town hall and say, how'd we do? So that began to build trust. And we were able to show sequentially how each time we did this, the numbers were going back up, not just for communication metrics, but for organizational health and engagement metrics. So there's a very clear alignment when you do that proactively. So, hopefully we kind of turn the corner on wait for something to go bad, and we're doing something proactively to really drive better engagement.
Yeah, I think anyone who thinks they're going to control the message is out of their minds at this point. I mean, we don't live in that world anymore where a message isn't going to get out and where your employees aren't going to comment on it. So I think it's a matter of, it's kind of one of the tenets of crisis communication. You want to get your message out there first, try to set the agenda on what it is. You don't want them to hear through the Google News alert. So it's, scheduling a town hall or doing whatever you have to do to make sure that message goes out from you in the way you want it to be formed first. And then hopefully you can make sure you can minimize any possible damage that could be done or eliminate it entirely.
And we cover that in the book. The influences on the employee communication function, and that could be where it reports or sits in an organization. It could be how the organization views the communication model or matrix. Do they view the world as an integrated world? Do they look at it in a more siloed and less contemporary way? So we talk about that. We talk about the influences of budget on what employee communicators can do. But all those influences, can shape the way that the function runs. But I think we also talk about the interdependencies between communications and HR and finance and brand marketing and brand and corporate reputation, that there, just as there is an invisible line between internal and external, there's an increasingly invisible line between employee communications and all those other functions. It really needs to be looked at in a very holistic sort of 360 degree shareholder view.
So that begs the question we always get asked: where does it sit?
Well, it sits in a lot of different places. And as someone who's worked for employee communications and general communications functions that have reported through legal, investor relations, human resources, marketing, I've seen it all. And some of these things tend to be cyclical, but the more common alignment these days is either through a separate corporate affairs or corporate communications function, or having the employee communications either dual or dotted to someone in the HR organization to ensure that there's alignment there. So you can make arguments for where it should be, connected, where it should reside, but I think that the solution will be as unique as each organization, its values, and how it looks at the contributions of communications in general to the way the business operates.
And I know something we talk about in the book is, depending on where communication sits, that's going to affect the way that communications work. If you're sitting in legal, you're going to communicate more in that way. If you're sitting in business, you're going to communicate more, maybe related to financial reports or in that kind of mindset. So, I mean, I think our big message is breaking down the kind of siloed approach. Communication is going to touch everything in the same way that IT tends to touch everything. And it's a matter of getting those messages out in the best, most strategic way possible that fits the corporate kind of structure.
Yeah, I think if I looked at the message I would give to any practicing communication professional is, if ever you were looking for content to help you show how you make a strategic impact to a business, I think we've covered it in this book, because it really does look holistically at that issue. How do you deliver value?
So what are some of the case studies? What companies are you talking about, so that folks who are on the call today can see how they might align with some of these other organizations?
I think we covered the gamut. So one of the things that we went into this book with is we didn't want to make it US centric. So we really, with our bios, examples, case studies, we tried to get kind of a worldview. So I think, I'm not positive, but I think we hit almost every continent, but maybe Antarctica, I think.
Yeah, we're still waiting for some best cases from there, but yeah, no, we didn't get that one.
Yeah, we did as well as we could to try to make sure we were representative.
Yeah.
But and we touched upon a lot of different industries. I mean, we've got everything from banks to tires to pharmaceuticals. We're kind of all over. But just because we wanted to show that there's not just one industry that needs this. There's not just one industry that has a certain approach. You'll see some commonalities as you look through the case studies with all the different things. You'll see that those communicators that were open-minded, thought outside the box a little bit, that did the research and followed the research, that really is what helped shape success. And being able to measure those things. I think, I love some of the case studies we have in the book, and they're all drawn from, I think, IABC and PRSA for the most part. So we're taking established case studies and award-winning case studies.
Yeah, I mean, one that I'm personally connected to is the Dow DuPont merger, which is, I think most people know, it's very large, $130 billion mega merger. They brought these two companies together for the sole purpose of carving up the assets into three new companies that would be leaders in their industry. But the time, it took almost 20 months from the date of the announcement to the date of the close, or day one, as we like to say, for employees to really understand, do I have a future here? What does that future look like? Keeping them engaged in the needs of the day-to-day business, while there was such, there were not clear answers on a lot of the key questions that they had, and how the team at DuPont came up with strategies, in many cases that relied on creative juices, right? So people think this is all just science and numbers, and it's like, well, yeah, that's a big piece of it, and that is how we demonstrate value. But for those of us who love to use that right brain and say, I want to come up with something that's creative, and there's so many opportunities. And I think, to Jon's point, all of these case studies show something that's very creative in the minds of the teams that put them together. So I know we've got a case study also from Africa that involves safety around cutting trees. And I mean, it's really just fascinating to see how the teams, put together these innovative solutions, and yet very strategic at the same time. So all the case studies have a consistent model to them and how we reported them. We talk about what the problem is, we talk about the strategies, we talk about the challenges they had, and then we talk about what were the results that they delivered for the business. So, and then to John's point about profiles, we've got people from Singapore, Melbourne, London, Sao Paulo. I mean, really interesting folks who, and we have a case from Corteva AgriScience that really goes into details about how they handled the pandemic when they sent everybody home, and how do they keep those employees engaged, because it was a brand new company, probably less than a year after they'd gone public, and boy, they really needed that momentum and needed to find ways to engage their employees, and that's exactly what they did. So just lots of diversity in how we looked at both profiles and the case studies.
Awesome. We have a couple questions. And as we move into this second part of our event, please put your questions into the Q&A, and I will moderate them. So the first question is there any data in the book that demonstrates how well or how poorly communications can impact financial performance?
Yes, is the short answer. Particularly when we get to the employee engagement and what the impact of poorly managed change does to organizations in terms of the bottom line. So there are metrics around productivity, there's metrics around innovation, et cetera. We tend to focus on the more positives about how does employees deliver a positive result for their organizations, and I think we do that pretty consistently, not only through the case studies but in the general content of the book.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, one of the case studies that struck a chord with me was the one we looked at for Michelin, and they were struggling with their North American sales, and they couldn't figure out what the problem was, and because the data kept coming back and it kept showing poor performance, and the salespeople weren't getting the messages, and they did, and then it was kind of like why did we not see this? The salespeople aren't behind a desk. So they were doing all these communications meant for people who were sitting in one place, and not for people who are behind a steering wheel. And so it meant adopting new strategies for this huge part of their labor workforce by using podcasts and other more mobile sorts of things, developing ways they could get it while on the road. And, again, it's trying to get out of what you always do to look and make sure you're serving all of your employees. But by doing that, all of a sudden, you greatly improve your financial performance. I mean, it's very quantifiable to show you've got employees that are engaged, you've got employees who can do their jobs better.
And I think also the case studies are aligned with the content in each chapter. So even in the chapter on ethics and compliance, what is the financial value to making sure that you have an ethical and a compliant way of communicating? And there was a great case study in there that showed there was a measurable result, a positive one. In many cases, they're very financially oriented, as you would think most of them would be. But we did, as best we could, try to align the case studies with the content in each chapter.
And the bios also fit with the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Your comment about the mobile workforce, salespeople, but now we're kind of all mobile workforce, right? Actually leads very well into the second question is, I wonder how distributed and outsourced workforces will impact labor unions, vice versa, communications. How do you think about communications in this world where you really are thinking much more inclusively about not only where people are, but what their relationship is to the organization? And how do you think about that in new ways, more effective ways?
John, I'll let you take that and I'll jump in.
So, I think a lot of this may have to be a bit of a learning process. I think it's going to have to be, you're not going to be able to necessarily have the face-to-face meetings you're used to. It's going to have to be adopting new technologies like the Zooms and the Teams, possibly using the AR and the VR as we talk about in kind of our Where's the Future of the Profession Going chapter, as well as, just utilizing whatever tools you can to get the messages out there and create those collaborative opportunities.
And I will go right back to the message we had about this continuous feedback loop, right? If you don't know what these stakeholders are thinking and how they're reacting or responding to either what you're sending, what outside, what other interested parties are sending, you're never going to be able to truly solve, because you don't know what they know and you don't know what they're thinking about. So I think between that and then this whole idea of how are you engaging heads and hearts, do you have a really strong story to begin with? Because a lot of times people look to communications to solve things that communications cannot solve. So if for example, employees, prospective employees, current employees are going to make an issue about your environmental story, your social presence story, your governance, all those things in ESG that are rapidly becoming high priority items, and you don't have a good story to tell, all the communications in the world isn't going to fix that. But if you do have good story to tell and you're not telling it as well, and that can impact the way that they're thinking or feeling about the organization, and you're getting that feedback, you have the analytics to show it, you're going to have a far greater tools to help you create the strategies that you need. One of the things we didn't really get too deeply into it relates to the chapter on future forces and technologies. Artificial intelligence is going to be a massive help to employee communicators. There's an example that Shell Holtz shared with me that companies are already using AI to do things like drafting quarterly releases. You feed the numbers into them and they begin to tell the story. Now, I don't think that they'll match the storytelling prowess of a human being, at least not for a long, long time. But when you think about the predictive nature, predictive analytics that you can start to get from what you're sending, how it's being received, when it's open, how much time are people spending with it, what day, what time will it best be read, those are the kinds of things really can be a massive help and a tool for employee communicators. But in order to use them and to use them effectively, we have to know about them. So this is, the book again serves as a go out there and find out what's happening. Talk to your IT folks. What are they doing with predictive analytics? What are they doing with blockchain? What are they doing, with all these, massive emerging technologies that are going into the cloud in some cases, and other cases, they reside independently within these organizations. So you got to go out and talk. You can't wait for something to come find you.
Yeah, I was introduced to a technology, gosh, probably a decade ago, that could take statistics, say, from a Little League game, and just take all the stats throughout that game, and could write a story, and not just write the story about what happened and who won, but could write a story for the losing team to put in their newsletter. Even infusing some empathy into the data, which is pretty incredible. And that was a decade ago. So
it's happening. It's really happening. And I think, communicators tend to think of, technology as, something in IT that is for IT or other general purposes. And we need to start reframing technology to say, this is something that impacts us. These are tools that we should be gaining access to, we should be looking for, we should be better understanding, and we can make better decisions, and even influencing, spending about, let's get our hands on some artificial intelligence that helps us do our job better, right? So there's a section on measurement that Jon talked about, that which gets measured gets done and supported, and I always add, and funded. So when you have a story to tell because you've been strategic and you've really looked at the numbers, you're going to have greater success in getting some funding for things like artificial intelligence to help you do these predictive analytics and help you get even better at what you do.
Yeah, I mean, January 2020, I don't think anyone, if you had said Zoom to people, they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. But it's a powerful tool that we all saw over the last 18 plus months. So I agree. To me, it's using AI or whatever it might be. There's no difference between that and using Word and PowerPoint with the way we've been doing it. It's what can help you do your job better and reach people more effectively.
We have a couple more questions. One, the way employees want to receive information has changed drastically with the advent of 24-hour news cycles, social media, et cetera. Do you have any data or insights on preferences that corporations can apply? And I think, something that the communicators struggle with is the agility with which messages back to issues need to go, need to be able to be communicated. And sometimes they can get hung up with legal or hung up with senior management. I actually know this questioner, so we've talked about this before. So how can professional communicators within organizations keep pace with the expectations that communications will flow?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to this. So like I mentioned, so every year in our department, we put out something called the State of the Yaya report. And Yaya stands for Youth and Young Adults, so it's 18 to 24-year-olds. So we do a national survey, 700 plus people, and put it together. And this past year, we looked deep into jobs. And we actually have some of this data in the book because it's so relevant. We found that those who are 18 to 24 actually, they prefer to get messages through email. They really don't want to hear from their corporations through social media by and large. Email is perfectly fine with them. Texting is okay with them. But they do want to hear the information from their employers and not secondhand. So, I do think we can use techniques we've been using to reach whoever it is. I don't think we need to go to TikTok and create a dance to interpret what we want to say. I don't think we need to go to that extreme and just grab everything. I think it's a matter of, and some of it is the feedback loop. It's what do your employees want? How do they prefer to receive messages? And just asking them flat out and seeing, are there differences? And let's get the information out through multiple channels in multiple ways to make sure everyone's on board.
Yeah, I'll just add, John mentioned that we have a chapter on channel auditing. And there's a lot in that chapter about this obviously this very topic, and understanding even the personas or the demographic differences between millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Ys, and understanding how they have preferences. That doesn't mean it always and completely translates to how an organization and its employees have those preferences, but it certainly can begin to shape some potential theses about how we are creating information and how we're distributing it, right? But at the end of the day, it's like being able to audit those channels and understanding who's looking at them. I mean, there's passive metrics that tell you how, who clicked on what and how long they spent, how long they spent with it, did they like it, did they share it, et cetera. But then there's attitudinal insights that we talk about in the chapter on measurement, as well as channel auditing, that really give you a better sense of what's resonating and how is it resonating best. So between those two, disciplines and the emerging support that we could be getting from artificial intelligence, I think we're going to get some pretty awesome tools accessible to us to help make better decisions about that. But to answer the question directly, yes, there are some data and some insights included in the chapter on auditing channels, but it also connects to the chapter on measurement.
We have another question about AI, going back to kind of the technologies that allow content to be created from data. Is how worried do communicators have to be that they'll get replaced by the robots?
I know, I started my career in journalism, and I remember back in those days that was coming up of, computers are going to write the stories. We don't need journalists anymore. Again, I think it's a tool. I think it's something that can help you craft. From the research that we did for the book, and I was diving deep into the academic literature to see what was going on. I do not think we have to fear imminently that AI is going to start writing speeches or anything else. I do think it can help, though. In the same way Word does spell check, I think AI can help start formulating ideas or looking for patterns or those sorts of things. But no, I don't think we're going to be serving the robot overlords in the next few years.
Yeah, let me just add a tacit onto that. I think that as with any function or in any company, the things that are more tactical are being skimmed off the surface, right? So let me give you an example of one company I know where they're overtaxed. Every communicator is overworked and they're exhausted, and so some companies are beginning to take those tasks. Sending out invitations to global town halls, sending out the follow-up surveys, the reminders, all those things that, they're really more tactical. They're not so much, they're not communication strategic, what they deliver can be, but those tactical elements are being moved inside organizations as they create a shared services model. It's the same thing that's happened basically in HR. When you think about HR, a lot of what's happened in HR in large corporations has moved to self-service. It's moved to artificial intelligence. The tactical things that your local HR person used to do, they're no longer doing because they need to focus on more strategic delivery of value-added services. And I think the same thing is true for communicators and for employee communicators. I think that will happen at some point, these more tactical things, because it's already happening to some degree, but I can see that accelerating. But to Jon's point, I don't think it will take the strategy, the thinking, and being the more strategic player. And at the end of the day, that's the whole reason for writing this book, is to help employee communicators understand how do you tell a story that makes not just you, but your team and your function more strategic and more value added to the organization. And by the way, we're really focused on trying to get this book into business schools because we believe educating CFOs, CEOs, all these C-suite folks about the power of employee communications also raises the level of expectation, but also the level of understanding and cooperation and support from C-suite executives for this function, which, I think anybody who's worked in this for a while knows, there are times where you are, the best thing since sliced bread. And there are times where it's like, do they even think about the impact of this on employee communications? And so we're trying to elevate the skill base and the knowledge base and the strategic capabilities of those in the practice, but also making aware leaders, executives, that this is a powerful tool. Don't overlook it.
I think that when we talk about technology too, it really does demand of not just communicators. This is happening across every function, every company. We have to become, regardless of our age, more technologically savvy so that we can make better ethical decisions, right? And not think about things after the fact, thinking, wow, what were the unintended consequences of deploying this particular technological automation technique or whatever it was, so that we can be really thoughtful and have these wide-ranging discussions about the impacts of technology on our people, whether that is displacement, there are jobs that are being displaced, reskilling, information flow, engagement, whatever those knockoff effects are of deploying technology. I think, not just communicators, but a lot of people in functions that don't necessarily think they touch technology are like, not my problem.
Give you a great
it's
example.
Everybody's problem, right?
Internal communicators used to think that social media was for external communications only. And smart companies realized very early, hey, we could use social media platforms to begin building brand ambassadorship. And that's exactly what Pepsi did. And Sharon McIntosh and Sharon Phillips actually have a case study in the book about Pepsi. I mean, this was more than 15 years ago, where Pepsi built a brand ambassadorship around a program around social media. They engaged their employees to proactively talk about the brands and business and corporate social reputation through their social digital channels. But just an example of initially we thought, oh, social media, that's for the external people to do marketing, et cetera. It's like, no. We have to open up our minds and think differently about how employee communications and internal communications can play in that space too, and can deliver something of value for the organization.
Yeah, we actually did the same thing at Thomson Reuters. I can see who's on the call. And so some of you, I apologize, you've heard the story a gazillion times, but coming out of our HR department, they thought, wow, let's use our interns who understand social media. So again, we're talking about, more than 10 years ago. We'll give them just a hashtag, working at TR, and let them talk about what their experience was like as young people coming into maybe their first job, about what it was like to work at TR, and a little bit of training, but really not, here's the approved text kind of thing. It was a hashtag, working at TR. And it was meant to kind of make Thomson Reuters more accessible and cool for the new kids, right? Well, what happened was that not only was that successful from a recruitment and engagement standpoint for these younger employees, But the Reuters journalists, for whom we never governed their use of social media, there was a real wall between corporate and the news organization. They started using it to talk about their assignments, to the extent that they could, on my way to blah, 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 here's a photo, I'm going to cover this working at TR, which was awesome. Well, then years later, and even after I left, what we started to see was, and this goes back to the internal and external, employees continuing to use this hashtag long after any kind of formalized program around it had expired, where someone would see something like Thomson Reuters involvement in Pride. We would often sponsor those parades or whatever, Pride Day or Pride Month was, and use it to say, today is a day I'm particularly proud to work for Thomson Reuters working at TR. And then even last week, I saw something on LinkedIn of somebody talking about their day and where they started in their journey at Thomson Reuters and where they were and the kind of opportunities they've had. We've also seen people take stuff off of the Hub, which was our intranet, but not in an inappropriate way, but something that was a very nice interchange between a couple of employees or, something that happened, and say, this is why I'm proud to be a Thomson Reuters employee working at TR. So something like that you can do with no cost, lots of trust, little oversight, can take on a life of its own. And I mean, this hashtag has lasted for more than 10 years. I think at this point, and it is still just as relevant and powerful as it always was. So I love those kinds of examples where I was involved initially, but I can't say that was my program. And I don't think anyone in the organization would say that was my program. It was something we tried as an experiment, and then just the employees owned it. I think
it helps. It humanizes a corporation. It humanizes departments within the corporation that may not usually talk. It opens things up. I think that's the goal state that we're all trying to get to, is our employees become our brand ambassadors and are willing to talk about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, yes, that's the biggest thing. We're not paying them to do it. They enjoy it so much they want to talk about it.
Yeah. We had very formalized employee advocacy programs with platforms and approved text and measurements and all that too. And those were great. And we did social selling with the salespeople. But I got to say, this little, hashtag was probably the most powerful. We have another great question, and one that we often talk about with our clients, which is, what's the role of enabling and equipping those middle managers to be part of the employee communications ecosystem? How can we help to really equip them? What's the importance of doing that?
Number one, it is fundamental to any organization's efforts to engage all employees, is to empower their leaders to be champions of whatever information or change in particular that they're asking them to deliver. So you have to really start thinking about middle management or people managers as a segmented internal audience. Again, it's included in the book, but the importance of this particular internal stakeholder base could not be overstated. So you have to start thinking about them as you're planning your communications, as you're doing your strategies. So for example, when you have big news, there are always issues with being publicly held that might prevent some issues with, or create issues with timing. But to the extent you can give them a heads up, this is coming. Here's a special, briefing for you. Here's a Q&A that we prepared. We'll do a live webcast or Zoom meeting at X o'clock to kind of walk you through this. But again, in ways that are consistent with issues around disclosure. You begin to create not just an us-them, right? Because if I'm a middle manager and I have some big announcement that the company's made and I know nothing about it, first thing I'm going to say when my employee asks me is, they didn't tell me a lot about it. I know as much as you do. That's not how you build trust in your leaders. That's not how you build authenticity. And it's not how you create clarity and empowerment for your people leaders. So you have to think of them as a separate base. You need to create tools, processes and think about cadence. How quickly can we bring them in? Are there some of them that we need to bring in even earlier than communicating to all people managers, if it's, for example, in just a particular line of business or a function? But you have to think about them separately, and you have to build in the tools and the content and let them know that you're thinking about them, right? So this was a big issue for us when we were going through the Dow DuPont merger, is making sure that DuPont managers knew what was happening and knew a little bit more in terms of context, and they were prepared to answer tough questions as we went through some very difficult decisions and had to announce or explain them.
And I think Mark would probably endorse, just buy every middle manager, just buy them a copy of the book and give it to them, and that will also help.
Exactly.
Shameless shill.
There you go. I love it, John. That's why we work so well together.
It was a great segue to closing out. I mean, the other thing, going back to the employee advocacy programs and the brand ambassadors, is we used to make sure we had a very powerful intranet. And we also had, folks who were empowered to be employee advocates externally, and we briefed them like media. Here's an announcement that's going to come out.
Right.
And here's the FAQ, and here's how you can address this if you get asked about it. So it wasn't, maybe they were also managers and we're going to use that with their teams, but they were also going to probably use that in their, informal communications internally and externally, and really thinking about how those can be powerful amplifiers of the message. So.
By the way, Signet Jewelers, I'd say Signet Jewelers is one of my clients, and they own Kay and Zales and Jared's. And they had an amazing social tag called Signet Strong. They had to close every single one of their stores across the globe when this hit. And their employees so much loved and were around their brands and their businesses that they began talking in social media with the tag Signet Strong. If you check it out, you'll be amazed at what their employees said about them. So that's about empowering. It's about using social media for employees to tell their own story in an authentic way. So I'm sorry, I just had to get that out because it's
that's awesome.
Fairly contemporary. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Again, the book is Engaging Employees Through Strategic Communication. You can read an excerpt on Biznology. We will also be posting the recording of the session on Biznology. We'll send you all a link to that, as well as how to get the book. I want to thank everybody for coming today and for your great questions, but mostly I want to thank Jon Stemmle and Mark Dollins for your great session today, as well as for writing this book.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.